The morning of October 12, 1944, began like countless others in the Pacific Theater. Dark waters stretched endlessly beneath a pre-dawn sky as the massive bulk of the aircraft carrier USS Intrepid cut through the waves. But this was no ordinary morning. This was the day American naval aviators would launch the first carrier strike against Formosa, an island fortress bristling with Japanese fighters and defended by some of the Empire's most determined pilots. Deep within the carrier, in the cramped ready room, 47 young men sat on metal chairs, their flight suits already damp with nervous sweat despite the early hour. Most of them had never seen a Japanese aircraft in combat. They were green, untested, and about to face the largest concentration of enemy air power in the Pacific. The odds were stacked heavily against them, and every man in that room knew it. But they had something the Japanese didn't expect. They had Cecil Harris. To understand how a quiet school teacher from rural South Dakota would change the course of aerial combat in the Pacific, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to travel to a place far from ocean waves and aircraft carriers, to the endless wheat fields of Cresbard, South Dakota, where a young boy named Cecil Elwood Harris first looked up at the sky and dreamed of flying. Cecil Harris was born on December 2nd, 1916, into a world that was changing rapidly. His father, Howard, and mother, Jenny, worked a sprawling plot of farmland, surrounded by fields of golden wheat that waved like an ocean in the prairie wind. The Harris farm was home to dozens of horses, and young Cecil grew up learning the value of hard work, patience, and attention to detail. These were qualities that would serve him well in the cockpit of a fighter plane, though he couldn't know that yet. Growing up on that South Dakota farm meant rising before dawn, working until your hands were raw, and going to bed exhausted every night. But it also meant something else. It meant learning to read the weather, to anticipate problems before they arose, to stay calm when things went wrong. On a farm, panic could cost you a harvest, or worse, a life. These lessons sank deep into young Cecil's bones, but the timing of his childhood was cruel. Cecil was just 13 years old when the stock market crashed in 1929, plunging America into the Great Depression. 4 years later, when he was 17, the Dust Bowl storms began ravaging the Great Plains. He watched as massive clouds of dust turned day into night, choking the life out of crops and driving neighbor after neighbor from their land. Families that had worked the same soil for generations packed everything they owned into trucks and fled west, their faces hollow with defeat. The Harris farm survived, but barely. All around them, bankruptcy and despair spread like a plague. These were formative years for Cecil, years that taught him resilience, resourcefulness, and the importance of keeping your head when everyone around you was losing theirs. Years later, when enemy fighters swarmed around his Hellcat at 20,000 feet, that farm boy calm would prove invaluable. Despite the hardships, Cecil harbored a dream that seemed almost impossible for a poor farm boy during the Depression. He wanted to teach. He wanted to help solve the problem he'd witnessed firsthand, where rural families couldn't afford to send their children to school. So in 1936, at the age of 20, he enrolled at Northern State Teachers College. His mother, Jenny, was a practical woman who'd raised her children to be sensible and cautious. When Cecil mentioned his interest in learning to fly, she shut down the conversation immediately. Flying was too dangerous, she told him firmly. It was a luxury for rich boys with nothing better to do. Cecil needed to focus on his studies, become a teacher, and build a stable life. He listened to his mother, as he always did. But the dream of flying never quite left him. After just 1 year at Northern State, Cecil took a break from college to put his incomplete education to immediate use. He became a teacher in the tiny rural community of Onaca, South Dakota, teaching 7th grade to farm children much like himself. It was there that he met Eva, a young woman who would become his wife, though neither of them could imagine the extraordinary journey that lay ahead. The world was changing fast. In Europe, a man named Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany. In Asia, Japan had invaded China and was building an empire through conquest and brutality. War clouds were gathering, and even in remote South Dakota, people could sense that America would soon be drawn into the growing conflict. In 1940, Cecil returned to Northern State to complete his bachelor's degree. The timing couldn't have been more significant. The college had just begun participating in something called the Civilian Pilot Training Program, or CPTP. On the surface, it was a civilian initiative to train recreational pilots, but everyone knew its real purpose. America was preparing for war, and it needed pilots by the thousands. Cecil was now old enough to make his own decisions. Despite his mother's fears, he enrolled in the flying program in the fall of 1940. For a young man who'd spent his life looking up at endless prairie skies, the sensation of actually being up there, controlling a machine through three-dimensional space, was transcendent. He took to flying with a natural ability that surprised even his instructors. By the end of the year, Cecil had earned his private pilot's license. He was one of nearly 10,000 Americans to graduate from the CPTP in 1940. Many of those young men would soon be fighting for their lives in the skies over Europe and the Pacific. In March of 1941, Cecil enlisted in the Naval Reserve. He began the rigorous training that would transform him from a civilian pilot into a naval aviator. The training was intense, demanding, and unforgiving. Many washed out. But Cecil, with his characteristic calm focus, excelled at every phase. He was halfway through his intermediate training course at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi when the world changed forever. On December 7, 1941, just 5 days after Cecil's 25th birthday, Japanese carrier aircraft launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The news crackled over radios across America. The Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. Thousands were gone. America was at war. The attack transformed the mood at the training base overnight. What had been serious before became desperate. America needed pilots now, not in 6 months or a year. The instructors pushed their students harder. The students pushed themselves even harder. Every man there knew that comrades were dying in the Pacific while they practiced in the relative safety of Texas. Cecil graduated and received his wings of gold in March of 1942. He reported for duty aboard the escort carrier USS Suwannee on May 30th, but his first combat deployment took him not to the Pacific as he'd expected, but to North Africa. The Suwannee was a converted oiler, smaller and slower than the fleet carriers, carrying fewer aircraft and assigned less glamorous duties. Cecil became part of VGF-27, an escort carrier fighter squadron that provided air support during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. While their counterparts on fleet carriers engaged in dramatic dogfights, the pilots of VGF-27 flew patrol missions over Allied ships and strafed enemy positions on the ground. It was valuable experience, but Cecil wanted more. He wanted to face the Japanese, the enemy that had brought America into this war. He wanted to prove himself in the most dangerous arena of aerial combat, the Pacific theater where Japanese Zero fighters had dominated the skies since the war began. Finally, in early 1943, the Suwannee sailed for the Southwest Pacific to support operations in the Solomon Islands. The escort carrier was so small that her Wildcat-equipped fighter squadron was detached to operate from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the island that had become a byword for brutal jungle combat and desperate aerial battles. Flying from that muddy airstrip surrounded by the constant threat of Japanese attack, Cecil Harris got his first taste of real aerial combat. He scored his first aerial victory, then a second, downing 2 Japanese A6M Zero fighters. These weren't just victories, they were lessons, hard-earned knowledge about how the enemy flew, how they thought, how they fought. The Zero was an extraordinary aircraft, light, maneuverable, capable of turning inside almost any Allied fighter at low speeds. Japanese pilots had trained for years, many logging over 1,500 hours of flight time before seeing combat. They were skilled, aggressive, and utterly committed. Fighting them was like dancing with death, and many American pilots never survived their first encounter. But Cecil survived. More than that, he learned. He studied the Zero's strengths and, more importantly, its weaknesses. He began to develop tactical ideas, ways to use the strengths of American fighters against the Zero's vulnerabilities. These ideas were still rough, unproven, but they were taking shape in his mind. After his stint in the Solomons, Cecil was transferred to a new squadron, VF-36, which would later be redesignated as VF-18, Fighting Squadron 18. This squadron would become his legacy, though he didn't know it yet. VF-18 was reformed in early 1944 as part of Air Group 18, which would operate from the fleet carrier USS Intrepid. The squadron's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Edward Murphy, known to his men as Murph, was an intelligent and perceptive leader. When he looked at his roster of pilots, one thing became immediately clear. Most of his men were completely inexperienced in aerial combat. Of the 47 original aviators assigned to VF-18, fewer than half had even seen Japanese aircraft in the air. Even fewer had actually engaged in air-to-air combat. They were brave, well-trained in basic flying skills, but green as grass when it came to the reality of combat. In the skies over Formosa or the Philippines, that inexperience could get them all deleted. Murphy had one significant asset, though. He had Cecil Harris. Harris was the only member of VF-18 who had been in a serious air battle before. He'd shot down 2 Zeros. He'd survived when many others hadn't. Murphy recognized that this quiet, unassuming farm boy from South Dakota possessed something invaluable: combat experience and the wisdom to learn from it. So Murphy made a decision that would save countless lives. Despite being outranked by several other pilots in the squadron, Harris was made flight officer and put in charge of training. It was an unusual choice, bypassing the normal hierarchy, but Murphy valued experience and talent over rank. It was one of the smartest decisions he ever made. Cecil Harris was a teacher by trade, and now he had 46 students whose lives depended on learning his lessons. He approached the task with the same methodical dedication he'd once brought to teaching 7th graders in rural South Dakota. But these lessons weren't about arithmetic or grammar. They were about life and death. The squadron was equipped with the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, a relatively new fighter that was rapidly replacing the older F-4F Wildcat in frontline service. The Hellcat was a different beast from the Wildcat. It was faster, more powerful, better armed, but it flew differently, and that meant pilots had to fight differently. For years, American fighter tactics had emphasized dogfighting, turning inside the enemy, outmaneuvering them in horizontal combat. These tactics worked reasonably well against German aircraft in Europe, but they were often ineffective against the Zero. The Japanese fighter could turn tighter, climb faster at low speeds, and outmaneuver almost any Allied aircraft in a slow-speed turning fight. Many American pilots had perished trying to dogfight Zeros using conventional tactics. Cecil Harris had a different idea. The Hellcat, he realized, had advantages the Zero didn't. It was heavier, more rugged, faster in a dive. It had better vertical performance at high speeds. The Zero excelled in the horizontal plane of combat, but the Hellcat could dominate in the vertical plane, diving down, zooming up, using altitude and speed as weapons. Harris began developing a tactical philosophy he would later articulate simply and memorably: you have to kick the living daylights out of your plane. What he meant was that pilots needed to fly aggressively, violently, using every ounce of the Hellcat's performance envelope. No more gentle maneuvering, no more trying to turn with the enemy. The new way was vertical. Dive in fast, make your attack, zoom back up, hit them again, over and over, never staying in a turning fight, always using speed and altitude. But Harris knew that tactics alone weren't enough. His pilots needed specific techniques, practical maneuvers they could execute instinctively when adrenaline flooded their systems and enemy tracers filled the air. So he began teaching them something special, something he'd worked out through combat experience and countless hours of thought. It happened one afternoon during training in Hawaii. Several of the younger pilots were gathered around Harris, asking questions about combat tactics. One of them, a lieutenant junior grade named Harold Thune from Murdo, South Dakota, like Harris a farm boy, far from home, asked a question that had been troubling him. "What do you do," Thune asked, "when you've got a Zero right on your tail? When you're the one being chased, when every second counts, when you can almost feel the enemy's guns tracking you?" Harris paused for a moment thinking. Then he did something that fighter pilots often do when words aren't enough. He started gesturing with his hands. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Thune and put one hand in front of the other in a straight line. His right hand, positioned in front, represented an imperiled Hellcat under attack. His left hand, hovering just inches behind, represented the Zero on its tail, closing in for the elimination. Then Harris said something that sounded crazy to pilots trained in conventional tactics. "Well, why don't we do this, chop throttle? Horse it straight up." and his hands demonstrated the maneuver. The right hand, representing the Hellcat, suddenly pulled up in a steep, nearly vertical climb. As it rose, the left hand, the Zero, slid forward beneath it. Then the right hand came back down, positioning itself behind where the left hand now was. The positions had reversed. The hunter had become the hunted. The Hellcat pilot, Harris explained, would now be calling the shots from his enemy's 6 o'clock position. Thune had seen Harris execute variations of this maneuver during training flights, but hearing it explained so clearly, seeing how it could transform a defensive situation into an offensive one, was a revelation. It was elegant, counterintuitive, and potentially life-saving. The maneuver worked because it exploited fundamental differences between the two aircraft. The Zero was lighter and could turn tighter at low speeds, but the Hellcat was more powerful and had better energy retention in vertical maneuvers. When a Hellcat pilot chopped the throttle and pulled hard into a vertical climb, it bled off speed rapidly, acting almost like an air brake. The pursuing Zero, committed to its attack run, would shoot past, unable to slow down or climb as steeply. In that moment of transition, as the Hellcat hung in the air and then fell back into position behind the enemy, the tables would completely turn. But there was a catch, and Harris made sure his students understood it. In a live-fire situation, this maneuver meant bleeding off precious speed with an enemy on your tail. It meant trusting your aircraft, your training, and your instructor's word that the physics would work in your favor. It meant facing your fear and doing something that felt suicidal. Not every pilot could do it. Panic would make you run instead, trying to outrun the Zero in a dive or outturn it in a horizontal fight, and that's when you'd be shot down. Harris's gut told him to give it a shot when the moment came. The other young pilots watched, learned, and practiced. They took their Hellcats into mock combat, trying the vertical separation maneuver again and again until it became instinctive. Some got it immediately, others struggled, fighting their own instincts. But Harris was patient, methodical, determined to give every pilot the tools they needed to survive. One pilot who listened especially carefully was Harold Thune. He practiced the maneuver relentlessly, flying it in his mind during briefings, visualizing every step. He wanted to be ready because he knew that combat was coming soon, and when it arrived, there would be no time to think, only to react. According to one pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Bryant Walworth, Harris worked his very fingers off, getting them up to speed. Day after day, week after week, he pushed them harder, demanded more, never satisfied until they met his exacting standards. The other pilots nicknamed him Speedball because he flew so hard and fast, pushing his aircraft to its limits and beyond. There was a duality to Cecil Harris that fascinated his squadron mates. On the ground, he was quiet Cecil, the reserved school teacher from South Dakota who rarely raised his voice and treated everyone with respect. But in the air, he transformed into Speedball, a pilot of such aggressive skill that he seemed to bend the laws of physics to his will. His fellow pilots couldn't decide which was the real Cecil Harris. The answer, of course, was both. After more than 6 months of training in Hawaii, VF-18 embarked aboard the Intrepid in August of 1944. The carrier, known affectionately as the Fighting Eye, was part of Task Group 38.2 in Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet. The squadron's first combat operations came in early September, striking targets in the Palau Islands and Mindanao. They encountered little aerial opposition at first. It was almost anticlimactic for the young pilots who'd trained so hard, but that changed rapidly as the Intrepid moved north toward the Visayas. On September 13th, during strikes over Negros Island, the squadron encountered significant Japanese air opposition for the first time. The rookies of VF-18 suddenly found themselves in real combat with real bullets and real consequences. Cecil Harris led his division in a dawn strike that morning. When they encountered enemy fighters, he shot down 3 HAMP fighters and a Zero, becoming an ace in a single day. But more importantly, the tactics he'd taught worked. His pilots used the vertical separation maneuver, the speed and altitude advantage, exactly as he'd drilled into them. They shot down multiple enemy aircraft without losing a single Hellcat. It was a validation of everything Harris had been teaching, but it was only the beginning. On September 21st, the task group launched the first carrier strike against central Luzon since the fall of the Philippines nearly 3 years earlier. The Japanese were caught by surprise initially, but once they scrambled their fighters, the battle became fierce. VF-18 claimed 25 enemy aircraft shot down that day. One pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Charles Mallory shot down 5 Japanese planes in a single mission, becoming an ace in a day. When he returned to the Intrepid, his plane captain counted 67 bullet holes in his Hellcat. The squadron was proving itself in combat, racking up victories, but Harris knew the real test was still coming. The real test would be Formosa. Formosa, the island now known as Taiwan, was a Japanese stronghold. Intelligence reports indicated the presence of massive air bases across the island, with hundreds of fighters and bombers. The Japanese High Command had been hoarding these aircraft, keeping them out of combat in preparation for the decisive battle they believed was coming. When Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet approached the island in early October, the Japanese believed that decisive battle had arrived. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome commanded approximately 700 aircraft on Formosa and Kyushu when the battle began. Over the next 4 days, an additional 690 aircraft would fly in from bases in Japan and China. It represented the largest concentration of Japanese air power assembled since the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese were determined to stop the American advance, and Formosa was where they chose to make their stand. For VF-18, the assignment was clear but daunting. They would be part of a pre-dawn fighter sweep on October 12th, the first carrier-launched strike against Formosa in the war. Their job was to arrive over enemy airfields at first light and catch Japanese aircraft on the ground before they could take off. It was a dangerous mission. The Japanese would be on alert, and the American fighters would be operating at the extreme range of their fuel capacity over hostile territory. There was another problem. VF-18 was assigned to fly low cover, meaning they would be closest to the ground during the bombing runs. This made them the most vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and the first squadron that Japanese fighters would encounter if they managed to get airborne. It was the most dangerous position in the formation, and everyone knew it. The night before the mission, the pilots gathered for their briefing. Lieutenant Commander Murphy outlined the plan, going over approach routes, target assignments, emergency procedures. The young pilots listened intently, some trying to hide their nervousness, others wearing it openly on their faces. Cecil Harris sat quietly, as he always did, absorbing every detail. After the official briefing ended, several pilots gathered around Harris informally. They had questions, doubts, fears they didn't want to voice in front of the CO. Harris answered each question patiently, offering reassurance without false promises. He knew what they were facing tomorrow. He'd been there before. That night, lying in his bunk in the darkened berthing compartment, Harris stared at the metal ceiling just inches above his face. Around him, he could hear the sounds of the ship, the constant hum of machinery, the creak of metal, the ocean rushing past the hull. Somewhere in the darkness, one of the younger pilots was praying softly. Harris closed his eyes and thought about the fields of South Dakota, about Eva, about the classroom in Nonaka, where he'd once taught children their multiplication tables. That life seemed like it belonged to someone else now. The wake-up call came before dawn, as it always did before a major strike. The pilots shuffled to the ready room in the dark, drinking bitter coffee and trying to wake up fully. They suited up in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. Harris went through his pre-flight routine with the same methodical care he'd learned on the farm, checking every piece of equipment twice, making sure everything was exactly as it should be. On the flight deck, the Hellcats sat in neat rows, their wings folded up to save space. Plane captains swarmed over them, making final checks. The deck was a controlled chaos of activity, illuminated by red lights that wouldn't destroy the pilot's night vision. Harris climbed into his cockpit, settled into the familiar seat, and began the startup sequence. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine roared to life, its 2,000 horsepower shaking the entire aircraft. One by one, the other Hellcats fired up until the flight deck thundered with the sound of 48 massive radial engines. The noise was so loud that orders had to be given with hand signals. The catapult officer, wearing his distinctive yellow vest, directed each aircraft into position on the catapult. Harris's Hellcat was among the first to launch. The catapult crew attached the launch bridle, checked everything one final time, then gave the signal. Harris pushed the throttle forward, feeling the engine's power building. The catapult officer dropped to one knee and pointed down the deck. The catapult fired with a bone-jarring lurch, 0 to 100 miles per hour in less than 2 seconds. The Hellcat shot off the bow of the Intrepid, and Harris immediately felt the transition from being violently pushed forward to flying free. He dropped slightly as he left the deck, gaining flying speed, then began his climb. Behind him, one after another, the rest of VF-18 launched into the pre-dawn darkness. The 16 Hellcats of the fighter sweep formed up and began their long flight northwest toward Formosa. Murphy's division of 4 planes led the formation. The 2nd Division flew behind and to the right. Harris led the 3rd Division, positioned behind the 2nd and well to the left. The 4th Division flew behind and to the left of Harris. They climbed steadily, all of them flying at 150 knots, conserving fuel for the long flight ahead. The sun rose as they flew, painting the ocean far below in shades of pink and gold. It would have been beautiful under other circumstances. As it was, the pilots were too focused on the mission to notice. They were heading into the unknown, toward an island fortress defended by hundreds of enemy aircraft and countless anti-aircraft guns. As they approached Formosa, the radio came alive with brief coded transmissions. Other American aircraft were already engaging the enemy. The battle had begun. Harris's division reached their assigned target, an airfield on the northeastern corner of the island, just as planned. Below them, they could see aircraft parked in neat rows, hangars, fuel dumps, everything lit by the golden light of dawn. It looked peaceful, almost serene, until the first anti-aircraft shell exploded in a black puff of smoke 1,000 feet away. Suddenly, the sky erupted with flak. Black, brown, and white bursts filled the air at every altitude. The Japanese gunners were good, and they'd had warning that the Americans were coming. The Hellcats dove toward their targets, dropping bombs and strafing the parked aircraft on the ground. Harris focused on his attack run, shutting out everything else, picking his targets carefully, making every bullet count. As they pulled up from their strafing runs, climbing back to altitude, Harris spotted them. Japanese fighters, at least 20 of them, climbing hard to intercept. They were a mix of different types. Zeros, Hamps, some of the newer models he'd only seen in intelligence photos. They'd gotten airborne despite the surprise, and now they were coming for blood. The radio crackled with urgent calls. Bogies closing fast from the northeast. All divisions prepare to engage. Murphy's calm voice cut through the chatter, giving orders, directing his fighters into position. But Harris's division, flying low cover as assigned, was already in trouble. The Japanese fighters dove on them from above, using the same altitude advantage that Harris had taught his own pilots to exploit. They came in fast, multiple aircraft targeting each American plane, trying to overwhelm them with numbers. This was exactly what the young pilots of VF-18 had feared, and exactly what Harris had trained them for. Harris's voice came over the radio, steady and unhurried despite the chaos. "Break right, 3rd Division, execute separation maneuver on my mark." His wingmen responded instantly, pulling into defensive positions, keeping their heads on swivels, watching each other's backs. A Zero latched onto the tail of one of Harris's section, closing fast, the Japanese pilot lining up for the shot that would end an American pilot's life. Harris saw it happening and reacted with the speed of long practice. He rolled his Hellcat inverted and pulled hard, cutting inside the Zero's turn, forcing the enemy pilot to either break off or risk a collision. The Zero pilot, surprised by the aggressive maneuver, pulled away, and in that instant of hesitation, Harris was on him. Harris's 650 caliber machine guns spoke once, a brief burst that stitched holes across the Zero's wing root. The Japanese aircraft staggered, trailing smoke, then fell away, spinning. Harris didn't watch it go. There were more of them everywhere, turning the morning sky into a whirling maelstrom of aircraft, smoke trails, and tracer round. The battle spread across the sky. Individual combats broke out at every altitude. A Hellcat and a Zero would merge, pull into vertical climbs, each pilot trying to force the other into a mistake. At high altitude, Murphy's division was engaged with another group of enemy fighters. At mid-altitude, the 2nd Division was fighting for their lives against superior numbers. And then it happened. Lieutenant Junior Grade Harold Thune found himself in exactly the situation Cecil Harris had prepared him for. A Zero had gotten on his tail, and the Japanese pilot was good, really good. Thune threw his Hellcat into a hard turn, but the Zero followed, matching him turn for turn. Thune could see the tracer rounds reaching out toward him, getting closer with each burst. For a fraction of a second, panic tried to take hold. Every instinct screamed at him to keep turning, to keep trying to shake the enemy, to dive away, and hope his Hellcat's speed would save him. But then he heard Harris's voice in his head, calm and certain. "Chop throttle. Horse it straight up." Thune's left hand yanked back on the throttle control lever, rapidly slowing the flow of fuel to his engine. The big radial sputtered in protest. At the same time, his right hand pulled back on the control stick with white-knuckle force. The Hellcat's nose came up, pointing nearly straight at the sky. For an endless instant, Thune's view was nothing but blue. He kicked hard on his right rudder pedal, skidding the plane, and held his breath. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability, when everything depended on the enemy pilot being unable to match the maneuver. The Zero flashed past beneath him. The Japanese pilot had been going too fast, committed to his attack angle, unable to pull up as steeply as the Hellcat. For a split second, the two aircraft existed in the same space at different altitudes, passing each other like cars on a highway. Thune reversed the maneuver, letting his Hellcat's nose drop. The aircraft sank like a stone until he was back in line with the Zero, which was now directly in front of him. He nudged the throttle forward and felt the engine surge back to life. The Hellcat accelerated, closing the distance. He started lining up his shot, the gun sight settling on the Zero's tail. But before he could fire, the Japanese pilot did something unexpected. The enemy simply bailed out, abandoning his aircraft rather than continuing the engagement. Perhaps he was low on fuel, perhaps his aircraft was damaged, or perhaps he'd recognized the futility of the situation and chosen survival over honor. Thune would never know, but the maneuver had worked. Just as Cecil Harris had promised, it had turned a defensive situation into an offensive one. Thune was alive, and his opponent was floating toward the ocean beneath a parachute. It was a moment Thune would remember for the rest of his life, and he knew who to thank for it. Across the battlefield, other VF-18 pilots were having similar experiences. The tactics Harris had drilled into them, the vertical separation maneuver, and the aggressive use of speed and altitude, were working exactly as promised. The Japanese pilots, many of them inexperienced recent graduates, rushed through abbreviated training, found themselves confused by American fighters that refused to fight the way they expected. The enemy pilots were used to Allied aircraft that would turn and burn, trying to outmaneuver them horizontally. But these Hellcats kept climbing and diving, hitting and running, never staying still long enough to pin down. To the Japanese pilots, it must have seemed like there were more American aircraft than there actually were, because the same Hellcats kept reappearing from different angles, different altitudes, different positions. This was the magic of Harris's tactics. By using the vertical plane of combat, by constantly changing altitude and speed, the 16 Hellcats of VF-18 could engage many more Japanese aircraft than their numbers suggested. A single Hellcat could climb away from a fight, zoom back down on a different enemy, climb away again, hit a third target. The Japanese pilots, trying to track individual American aircraft, found it nearly impossible. Cecil Harris himself was in the thick of it. He shot down his second aircraft of the day, a Hamp fighter that made the mistake of trying to turn with him. Harris didn't take the bait. Instead, he pulled vertical, climbed until the Hamp stalled trying to follow, then dove back down with speed and gravity on his side. The Hamp pilot never had a chance. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 20 minutes. 20 minutes of the most intense combat any of them had experienced, and then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The Japanese fighters broke off, either running low on fuel or recognizing that they were taking unsustainable losses. The sky cleared. Harris did a quick count over the radio. All of his division was still flying. Then came the reports from the other divisions. Some pilots were damaged, some were low on fuel, but they were all there, all 16 Hellcats, still in the fight. They had to get home, though, and that meant running a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire as they climbed away from the island. One pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Egidio Di Battista, took a hit that damaged his aircraft badly enough that he couldn't keep up with the formation. Harris, without hesitation, dropped back to escort him, leaving his own division to return home, while he stayed with the wounded bird. They flew together, Di Battista nursing his crippled Hellcat, Harris watching the sky around them for any threat. At one point, a lone Zero appeared, perhaps drawn by the sight of the damaged American aircraft. Harris engaged immediately, shooting the enemy fighter down, his fourth victory of the day. Di Battista kept flying, kept pushing his damaged aircraft toward safety. They made it back to the fleet, but de Batista's Hellcat was too damaged to land aboard. He had to bail out near the ships, breaking his leg during the descent. Rescue boats picked him up within minutes. He survived, thanks in large part to Cecil Harris staying with him instead of heading home to safety. When Harris finally landed aboard the Intrepid, his plane captain ran up to inspect the aircraft. The young sailor walked around the Hellcat carefully, checking every surface, looking for damage. Then he stood back, confused. There wasn't a single bullet hole, not one piece of shrapnel, not even a scratch. Harris had flown through one of the most intense aerial battles of the Pacific War and emerged completely unscathed. It would become a pattern. During Harris's entire 88-day tour with VF-18, his aircraft would never be hit by enemy fire. Not once. Some pilots said it was luck. Others thought it was skill. Harris himself never commented on it, but those who flew with him knew the truth. It was awareness, anticipation, always being one step ahead of the enemy, never putting himself in a position where luck had to save him. The first day of the Formosa air battle had been a stunning success for the Americans. VF-18 alone claimed 25 enemy aircraft destroyed during the morning sweep and 46 throughout the entire day. Approximately one-third of Japan's fighter strength on Formosa was wiped out by that initial strike. The Japanese lost over 100 aircraft on October 12th alone, while the Americans lost fewer than 20. But the victory came at a cost for VF-18. 3 pilots were missing in action. Ralph DuPont and Wesley Keels would later be declared gone. Bill Ziemer survived as a prisoner of war until August of 1945, when he passed away from brutal treatment at Camp Ofuna. The low-cover assignment had proven deadly, and a third of all fighters lost by the task group came from that single mission, all from Fighting 18. The battle over Formosa continued for 4 more days. The Japanese kept sending waves of aircraft against the American fleet, desperate to score a decisive victory. But they were throwing inexperienced pilots into combat against American aviators who were getting better with every engagement. The tactics Cecil Harris had taught were spreading throughout the fleet as other squadrons saw what VF-18 was accomplishing and adapted their own combat methods. By the time the Formosa air battle ended, on October 16th, the Japanese had lost over 300 aircraft destroyed in the air, plus countless more destroyed on the ground. American losses were fewer than 100 aircraft. The Japanese Navy's combined fleet had been effectively stripped of air cover, a loss that would prove decisive during the Battle of Leyte Gulf less than 2 weeks later. For Cecil Harris, Formosa was just the beginning. Over the next 6 weeks, he would shoot down 24 Japanese aircraft in total, making him the second highest scoring ace in the entire U.S. Navy. He would have 3 more 4-victory days, a feat almost unheard of in the Pacific. He would earn the Navy Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Silver Star, and multiple other decorations. But perhaps his greatest contribution wasn't his personal victory count. It was what he taught the young pilots of VF-18, the tactics, the maneuvers, the mindset of aggressive vertical combat. These lessons saved dozens of lives, maybe hundreds, as they spread throughout the fleet. Other squadrons adopted the techniques. Instructors back in the States began teaching them to new pilots. One incident later in the deployment illustrated Harris's leadership perfectly. On a dark and stormy night, 20 fighters from multiple carriers were airborne when weather closed in around the fleet. Visibility dropped to nearly zero. The sea was angry, the carriers pitching wildly. Landing would be nearly impossible, and ditching in the ocean at night was almost certain death. The squadron commanders were on the radio, debating their options. Should they try to land in these conditions? Should they order the pilots to ditch while they still had fuel? There were no good choices. And then Cecil Harris's voice came over the radio, calm as ever. He thought he could make it to the ship. Without waiting for orders, Harris headed into the storm. Flying on instruments, trusting his training and his instincts, he searched through the darkness and rain. Miraculously, he found not just a carrier, but his carrier, the Intrepid. He landed safely, proving it could be done. The other pilots followed his lead, guided by his example. Thanks to Harris's daring, only 1 fighter pilot was lost that night instead of 20. Stories like this made Cecil Harris a legend among the pilots who served with him. He wasn't the loudest voice in the ready room. He wasn't the one telling war stories at the bar. He was quiet, reserved, almost shy. But when it mattered, When lives hung in the balance, he led by example and never asked anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself. Lieutenant Junior Grade Harold Thune, the man whose life had been saved by Harris's vertical separation maneuver, later said that Harris was very much responsible for training the squadron. He was better than the best. He didn't just tell you to do it, he showed the way. He was a leader among men. After the Intrepid was severely damaged by kamikaze attacks in November of 1944, VF-18 was sent home. Cecil Harris arrived stateside in mid-January of 1945, his combat tour complete. He'd survived when so many hadn't. He'd proven himself one of the greatest fighter pilots in naval history. He could have rested on his laurels, accepted his decorations, and moved on. Instead, VF-18 was reformed in late January, with many of the original pilots returning, and Harris was there with them, serving as flight officer once again. They trained on new aircraft, learned new tactics, prepared for what everyone expected would be the invasion of Japan itself. But the atomic bombings in August brought the war to an end before VF-18 could return to combat. Cecil Harris returned to South Dakota after the war and resumed his teaching career, just as he'd always planned. He married Eva in a quiet ceremony. He went back to the classroom, back to helping children learn, back to the life he'd known before the war. He rarely spoke about his combat experiences. He gave few interviews. When people called him a hero, he deflected the praise, insisting that the real heroes were the ones who hadn't come home. For a man who'd shot down 24 enemy aircraft, who'd been decorated multiple times, who'd trained an entire squadron in revolutionary combat tactics, Cecil Harris remained remarkably humble. To him, he'd just done his job, nothing more. When the Korean War broke out in 1951, the Navy recalled Harris to active duty. He served in the office of the Chief of Naval Operations at the Pentagon, far from combat, but still contributing to the service. He stayed in the Navy afterward, making it his career, eventually retiring as a captain in 1967. Years later, when historians began seriously studying the aerial combat of World War II, they recognized what Cecil Harris had accomplished. He was, according to naval historian Barrett Tillman, arguably the most consistently exceptional fighter pilot in the U.S. Navy. His 4 victory days, his tactical innovations, his leadership, all of it added up to a legacy that influenced naval aviation for generations. In 2009, a segment of Highway 20 in South Dakota was designated the Cecil Harris Memorial Highway. Senators John Thune and Tim Johnson, Harold Thune's son among them, read remembrances of Harris into the congressional record. A statue was erected at Northern State University, Harris's alma mater, honoring his service. But perhaps the greatest tribute came from the men who flew with him. Years after the war, when they gathered for reunions, their conversations always came back to Cecil. They remembered his patience, his skill, his willingness to put his life on the line for others. They remembered the maneuvers he taught them, the tactics that saved their lives. Harold Thune said it simply and powerfully. What Cecil Harris taught us may have saved our lives. That vertical separation maneuver, the one that seemed crazy the first time they heard about it, the one that required absolute trust and courage to execute, had worked exactly as promised. The story of Cecil Harris is remarkable, not because he was a born warrior, but because he wasn't. He was a farm boy who wanted to teach school. He was a quiet, unassuming man who'd rather read a book than to tell war stories. But when his country called, when his skills were needed, he stepped up and became something extraordinary. More than that, he thought. He learned, he innovated. He didn't just accept the conventional wisdom about how to fight. He studied the enemy, understood his own aircraft, and developed new tactics that gave his side a decisive advantage. In military history, those kinds of tactical innovations are rare and precious. The Japanese pilots who fought over Formosa that October morning in 1944 probably never knew the name Cecil Harris. They didn't know that the tactics confusing them, the aggressive vertical combat that made it seem like they were outnumbered, had been developed by a farm boy from South Dakota who'd started the war teaching 7th grade. They just knew that the American fighters were fighting differently, more effectively, and that they were losing. That's what tactical innovation looks like in war. It's not always dramatic. It's not always obvious. Sometimes it's just a simple maneuver, a shift in thinking, a willingness to try something new. But when executed properly, when taught to others, when spread throughout a force, it can change the outcome of battles, maybe even wars. The lesson of Cecil Harris isn't just about aerial combat. It's about the power of education, of sharing knowledge, of leadership that focuses on making others better rather than just personal glory. Harris could have kept his tactics to himself, racked up an even higher score of personal victories. Instead, he spent his time teaching others, training them, making sure they had the tools to survive and succeed. In the end, that's what made Cecil Harris truly exceptional, not the 24 victories, impressive as they were, not the medals, though they were well earned. What made him exceptional was that he took what he'd learned through hard experience and dangerous combat, and he gave it away freely to anyone who would listen. He made his students better than they could have been without him, and in doing so, he probably saved more lives than we'll ever know. When the sun set over the Pacific on October 12, 1944, 47 young men who'd taken off in the pre-dawn darkness were still alive, still fighting, still flying. 3 wouldn't come home, but the others would, thanks in large part to the crazy maneuver a farm boy had taught them. A maneuver that turned hunters into hunted, that confused the enemy, that made 16 Hellcats seem like 60. That's the power of innovation in combat. That's the legacy of Cecil E. Harris, a quiet hero who changed the war one maneuver at a time.